Sunday with Lance Meadow.
3 in the books, one more to toy with as we take you up till noon Eastern here on this Sunday morning. Thanks so much for waking up early with us as we have navigated plenty of topics in the world of sports, including the college landscape. Later today, the Iowa women's basketball team will wrap up its regular season at home against Ohio State on Senior Day. Caitlin Clark, 18 points away from breaking Pistol Pete Maravich's NCAA Division I all-time scoring record of 3,667 points. But it really starts and ends on the surface there. Pistol Pete did it in 3 seasons of varsity ball. Freshman stats don't count. Caitlin Clark, 4 seasons, 129 games versus Pistol's 83. And to delve into what it was like suiting up with Pistol Pete on the collegiate level and experiencing when he broke Oscar Robertson's mark back in 1970. We're joined by his teammate who was part of the same recruiting class. They played freshman ball together, then all 3 varsity seasons at LSU from 1966 to 1970, and that is none other than Rich Hickman. Rich, you got Lance Meadow here on Sirius XM Mad Dog Sports Radio. Greatly appreciate the time this morning. Hope all is well. How's everything on your end?
All is well here, Lance, and I appreciate you having me on. And as you mentioned, I was privileged to be able to play 4 seasons with the Pistol and see firsthand how great he was and how great he was going to be.
Well, that's why I'm really excited to have a conversation with you, Rich, because I've talked with several of your other LSU teammates, but nobody can mention they were with Pistol Pete from the start. They only overlap. So let's go back to the beginning. You were part of the same recruiting class. How much did you know about Pete Maravich? Because he was obviously a prolific scorer on the high school level. And what were your first impressions when all of a sudden he goes out there and drops 50 points in your first ever freshman game?
Well, it really started before the first game. When we got on campus, of course, LSU being a big football school and very few basketball conversations going on, we arrived on campus, and again, everybody was talking about football, but the freshman team would go into the old gym armory and practice by ourselves, and this is before we were actually allowed to start official practice. And we'd all go to the football games, and after the football game, we'd sneak into the armory at 11 o'clock at night and go practice and work out till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. So people thought we were kind of crazy, but we got to look and see how good Pete was way before that first game and 60 points that he dropped on Southeast Louisiana.
From what I understand, Rich, the team that was on the varsity level when you came in as a freshman, clearly they weren't very good. They finished 3-23. And more often than not, the freshman team would play before the varsity team, and you would have monster crowds, and then people would be like, well, that was the main event. I'm not staying for what's going to be a disappointment. So how much did Pistol Pete transform the conversation on LSU's campus where you said it was a football school, but little by little, people started to all of a sudden pay attention and become invested in basketball? Well,
that's a true statement. When we got ready for our first game against Southeastern as freshmen, the varsity players were telling us, now, look, don't expect a whole lot of people in the stadium, in the arena, because they just don't support basketball. And the problem was a lot of the guys on the freshman team came from big basketball schools. I was from Pennsylvania. Jeff was from Indiana. Drew was from Illinois. Of course, Pistol coming from North Carolina. We all had several thousand at our high school games. So we were kind of down in the dumps, and we're all in the dressing room way before the game started. We come out of the dressing room, and the place is absolutely packed. And we kind of looked at each other. We thought maybe the varsity guys were just ragging us. So we played the game. We broke the scoring record. Pete dropped 60. Jeff and I both had 20, 30 points, something like that. We go into the dressing room, we're all giving high fives. We get dressed, take a shower, get dressed, go back out for the varsity game. And there's maybe a couple hundred people left in the stands.
Wow.
And we all kind of looked at each other. And again, it proves your point. They came to see the Pistol, but there was a lot of buildup, not only with Pete, but the recruiting class, again, because we all came from basketball country. and I guess the people knew what to expect from the varsity because it had been there so long, they left. But as the year went by, even though the team was 3-23, more and more people stayed to watch the varsity game because I think Pete and the freshman team were able to get the true basketball enthusiast excited about basketball again. And that was really one of our missions that Press talked to us about. He said, look, we're here to build the basketball culture, and it's up to you guys to start the process.
You brought up the name Press. For my audience to understand, Press Maravich was your varsity coach and obviously the father of Pistol Pete. I would think, Rich, that's a difficult dynamic for Pistol Pete to walk into. And he was around his father, obviously, throughout his entire basketball career. But now on a daily basis, you're getting coached by dad. You are the best player. You have to live up to expectations. And for you and your fellow teammates, how you even viewed that in saying, well, wait a minute, we're decorated high school basketball players. We don't want to just take a back seat to Pistol Pete simply because his dad is the head coach. So how did all of you navigate those very, very unique dynamics in play?
That's a good point. There were, some of us, and I can speak for myself, I came from a basketball school, but it was a small town, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is where actually Pete was born. You're there on a full scholarship, coming from a small town, and you're there to get an education. You're on a mission. Some guys that we recruited had a really, really hard time being able to comprehend the relationship between Press and Pete. They came from schools and towns where they had the 3 or 4 inch headlines when they were in high school. And we'd tell them when they were recruiting and coming in to visit, now, you got to understand one thing. Pistol's going to get the headlines. You're here to play ball, and you're going to have a good time. You're going to get great education. But if you're expecting the 3 inch headlines consistently, forget it. It's not going to happen here. So there were some of us who accepted it well, and I think we're able to succeed and have a great career in basketball and a great education. There were some guys who just couldn't hack it, and they'd stay a year or two, and they were gone. They went somewhere else. So it really depended on the person and the personality and the makeup of whether they can wanted the success for themselves or wanted success for the team.
We're talking with Rich Hickman. He goes way back with Pistol Pete Maravich, the legendary basketball player who started LSU and ultimately set the NCAA Division I scoring record in 1970. They were together on the freshman team, then played 3 seasons together on the varsity level for Pistol Pete's dad, Press Maravich. I was reading, you talked about how much the freshman team flourished, Rich. So you go 17-0 from what I understand. Then you added a game at the very end against Tennessee, lost a heartbreaker. Your only loss that year after you were undefeated, and Pistol Pete goes to the free throw line at the tail end of the game when you're down by 2. He makes the first free throw with under a minute to go. He misses the second, and he was an 83% free throw shooter, and ultimately you fall short. I'm curious, A, how accurate that is, and what you remember from that game in terms of how that may have defined his approach moving forward, knowing how much pressure was on him game in and game out.
What you said is exactly correct. The Tennessee was not on our schedule. We had finished our official schedule, and the athletic directors of both schools, because of the records of both teams, decided to add the game at Tennessee for our 18th game. Pete did go to the line for a 1-on-1. He made the first, missed the second. We lost the game. Of course, we got dressed, stayed for the varsity game. It was time to take the bus back to the hotel. Everybody's looking for Pete, and Pete's nowhere to be found. We couldn't find him, so the bus leaves. We go to the hotel, and there's Pete sitting in his room at the hotel. We're saying, what happened? Pete was so upset that he missed that free throw shot, he walked back to the hotel after the freshman game. And that not only, I think, defined how bad Pete wanted to win, but it also defined to us on our freshman team how we needed to be there to support him and encourage us of how much winning meant to us.
Rich, based on what you just said, how competitive your games were on the freshman team, and I'm not saying you have the answer to this question, but what I can't wrap my head around is why does the NCAA not acknowledge even your tallies from your freshman year and have that as part of your combined scoring record as an individual? Because shortly after you guys went on and graduated, they did ultimately change the rule where freshmen could play varsity ball. But why are we still, after all these decades later, not recognizing what individuals like yourself accomplished as freshmen?
I think that's a $64,000 question. I mean, I think, the NCAA, I think a lot of the decisions and policies they make, even in today's world, that people question why they do things or why they haven't made changes. Again, their definition of varsity is varsity. It's not talking about your career. Back then, freshman was part of our career, but it wasn't quote unquote varsity. And the way they count their record is it's varsity points, which I agree with you. It's pretty asinine because, again, his freshman year was part of his career in college basketball. And if you add his career, you're talking about another 741 points. The Pistols' total of 3667, again, which is out of reach for just about anybody.
Without a doubt. That's more of a reason why, not to take anything away from Caitlin Clark, she's done wonders for the women's game, but it's a different style game. It's a different generation. Pistol Pete should always be on a line all by himself, and he's going to always hold the men's record, but to even combine them, I don't think is being open to providing the necessary context to have this conversation. But you were there when Pistol Pete was approaching setting the new mark, because a guy by the name of Oscar Robertson held the record when he flourished at Cincinnati. And on January 31st, 1970, you play Mississippi. You win 109-86. And from what I understand, he needed 40 that night, and he only happens to score 53. What do you recall, Rich, going into that game, his mindset, and what was the media coverage like around that time when I'm sure all eyes, and as you mentioned earlier, all attention was on Pistol?
The media was really a basket case. They were everywhere you could imagine. I mean, they were on the court, they were in the rafters, they were outside as we walked in to get dressed. The fans were just going absolutely crazy. But from Pete's standpoint, Pete approached that game as any other game. He did not talk about the record before the game. Again, those of us that were around, and this is our fourth year around Pete, he approached that game from a business standpoint just like any other game. And when he was one shot away from the record, every time he shot, flashlights, flash bulbs were going off, people were screaming, and the ball, if he'd missed it, everybody's going, oh. When he finally made it, I mean, it was nuts. It was like an earthquake. Pete did not want the game stopped, by the way. But obviously, there was no way they were not going to stop the game and do the celebration and take the pictures and do everything you normally do when they break the record. But Pete was adamant he did not want the game stopped. But press, the coach and the media, there was no way they weren't going to stop the game. So, but again, from his standpoint, it was business as usual.
Rich, I'm very happy that you brought up the point that he didn't want the game stopped, because I was having this conversation earlier just about how we look at professional athletes and even collegiate athletes like yourself who had success, where the ultimate goal, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you could relate, the reason why you sacrifice your body, you play competitive sports, is you want to win. You want the team to have success. You want to ultimately win hardware. And it's interesting because while Pistol Pete had tremendous individual marks, that goes without saying, the one thing that has always eluded him is a title, whether it be on the collegiate level. You made the NIT your senior year in 1970, failed to make the NCAA tournament prior to that, and he just missed out on getting a ring with the Celtics in the NBA. I'm curious, the conversations you had with him over the years, maybe even following college, and when he looked back, he is the all-time leading scorer, but how much not getting the ring still was so much on his mind?
Again, he never really talked about it, but those of us who knew Pete and were around Pete, I think down deep that was probably one of the things that he ultimately wanted to have as part of his resume and never got. But he never complained about it. He never had sour grapes about it. Even when we were in college, again, not getting to the tournaments, we really never had a big guy to go along with Pete to help us from a rebounding standpoint. But he again, down deep inside, I think it hurt him, but he was really never one to talk about it, complain about it, or have sour grapes about it.
It's interesting you brought up not having the big man. For my audience to understand, you were a fellow guard like Pistol Pete. From what I've read and even just looking at highlights, wasn't always easy, Rich, it seemed, even if you practiced with him, knowing when he was going to throw the ball because he wasn't necessarily going to look at you, given his knack for no-look passes. How challenging was that for even individuals like yourself in the backcourt to know and anticipate when the ball was going to come from Pistol Pete and how there were fair ups and downs in riding that wave?
Well, there's no question. And again, that's one of the reasons we started out the first day we were there, going to the old Gym Armory and practice. We learned early on to expect the unexpected. And I know you can't really rehearse that, but when you get a mindset of expecting the unexpected, you're always on guard for, hey, you're going to get a behind-the-back pass or a no-look pass, or it just happened. And I know we practiced and practiced and practiced all 4 years, even during non-basketball season. It was tough to do, but we as college kids, and I always had this problem when they first went to the pros, we were able to adjust to the unexpected. When he went to the pros, and he did the same thing his first couple of years, here's guys making millions of dollars with the ball bouncing off their hand, bouncing off their head, bouncing off their feet, not ready to receive a behind-the-back pass or between-the-leg pass or a no-look pass. And this is Rich Hickman speaking personally. I think some of the people in the pros held it against Pete and tried to make him look bad his first year or two. That's Rich Hickman speaking. Because if an 18-year-old can learn to expect the unexpected, someone in their 20s making $1 million a year can learn to expect the unexpected.
Fair point. It's new. He's flashy, and that rubs people the wrong way. I mean, we've seen that over the history of basketball. I think that's been well documented, and it's more of a reason why context, to me, Rich, is so important, which is what you're helping to bring to the table. And I want to circle back to, obviously, why I'm having you on the program, why we're even talking about Pistol Pete. Not that we should go out of our way. He clearly is a decorated player in the history of basketball, but Caitlin Clark is on the brink of surpassing this total. As I mentioned off the top of our conversation, I think both records should stand alone because I think, once again, the volume of games she's played, it's a man versus a woman, different dynamics. You didn't have a three-point line. You didn't have a shot clock. But I'm curious how you view what's going on in the national conversation right now, Rich, and how you and your fellow teammates feel, because you lived it and you experienced it, and there's generations, and I'll admit I was not alive when Pistol Pete even played in the NBA, but I'm much older than the kids that are growing up today who think basketball was discovered in 2003. But how do you view what's going on with the dialogue currently in terms of Caitlin Clark versus Pistol Pete?
Well, I'm like you. Well, again, I've had the honor playing and watching Pete, and I've seen Caitlin in person and on TV, and she is one heck of a basketball player. She is impressive. She has helped with women's basketball. The thing that's impressive to me about her is she can shoot from anywhere, and when she does, she is squared up to the basket, and she knows what she's doing. But to me, you can't compare the two. You have women's basketball, and you have records, and you have men's basketball, and you have records. If you look at the NCAA for whether good or bad, they have women's basketball records, and they have men's basketball records. Pete changed, I guess records are there, but to compare the two, in my opinion, you can't compare the two. Pete changed the game of basketball. Completely changed basketball, whether you're talking about the NBA, whether you're talking about college basketball, with his passing, with his dribbling, with his movement on the court. He was ahead of his game by at least 10 years. You look at what they're doing in NBA and college basketball today, Pete was the lone goat doing that. And he got criticized for that. You made the comment earlier that he rubbed people the wrong way because of what he did. Pete made the comment early on in his college career that one of the things he wanted to do was entertain the fans. And because someone asked him one time, a reporter asked him, why don't you just make a two-handed bounce pass? Why do you have to do it behind the back or between the legs? And Pete's comment was, people are here to watch us play, and they're here to see a show. A two-handed bounce pass does not get it done. If I can accomplish the same end result with a behind-the-back pass or between-the-leg pass, and a guy get a layup, and I get an assist, what difference does it make to you? And he was exactly right. That's why he was there. That's why he was called a showman. He rubbed opponents the wrong way, and a lot of the media held it against Pete. They called him a showboat. Well, but Pete didn't call himself a showboat. He called himself a showman. And that's exactly what he was, and that's exactly one of the reasons we were there to help him put on his show.
Well, what you just perfectly laid out is it's sports entertainment at the end of the day, whether it's college or the professional ranks. We don't get invested in these conversations, and we don't sit at the edge of our seat and watch unless we're entertained. So he fulfilled those principles. As a quick follow-up, Rich, and I greatly appreciate your time and insight, you got me thinking. You mentioned that he was a showman. What about trash talking? Because you mentioned in passing, he didn't talk about records and maybe failing to get a ring, but what was he like with the opposition on the court? Considering, I mean, the guy averaged 44 points a game. Did he give it to people? Did they talk back to him? How did those dynamics play out?
He made his actions on the court speak for himself. I don't ever remember him trash talking. Now, he and we got a lot of trash talk to us. Again, because of who he was and how much he scored and all the passing and dribbling that he did on the court. A lot of the opposition felt he was doing that to belittle them, and so they did a lot of trash talking. They did a lot of fouling, but he just took it in stride. I think his trash talk was the end result, and he would just sit there and look at him and smile. That was his version of trash talking. If someone tried to intimidate him or make him look bad, and he'd come down and do a behind-the-back pass or a dribble between his legs, he'd just look up and smile as if to say, "Hey, bud, I told you so. You're not going to mess with me." That was his way of quote-unquote trash talking.
And it's understandable because he certainly let his game do the talking. He is Rich Hickman. He was teammates with Pistol Pete Maravich all 4 years, including the freshman team, 1966 to 1970. He was there when Pistol broke Oscar Robertson's mark in 1970 against Mississippi. Rich, really enjoyed the conversation. I can't thank you enough. I appreciate your time, your insight, and reminiscing, and I very much look forward to talking down the road. Thanks for coming on the program.
Lance, I appreciate it. You have a great day.
You as well. My pleasure. Some great stories and great insight into what it was like being around Pistol Pete Maravich, specifically on the freshman team. That's why I wanted to hear from Rich, because I've talked to several other players. You can check it out on the Sirius XM app. But he was there all 4 years. He saw what started. 741 points as a freshman. And speaking of statistics, it just got me thinking as I was talking things over with Rich, because I have these numbers in front of me. Oscar Robertson, he set the mark of 2,973 points. That was the Big O's mark, the initial NCAA Division I scoring record. He did that in 88 games. Pete Maravich scored 3,667 in 83 games. So Pistol played 5 less games than Oscar, yet scored nearly 1,000 more points than him. Let that sink in before some of you go crazy over using that context to explain the differences between Pistol Pete and what Caitlin Clark is doing. It's insanity. You can use it to bring up the difference between two men. You can't use it to bring up the differences between a man and a woman. I mean, what are we talking about? Math is math. Ponder that as we move forward here on Mad Dog Sports Radio.